Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of the Haunted Walk, offering thematic walking tours in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director, and I really appreciate you joining us for the program. Over the past week since our episode on Ravenscrag came out, we've received a bunch of 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts. So if you were one of those reviewers, thank you very much. If you haven't had a chance yet to leave a review, we would certainly appreciate it. It's a little fuel for our fire and continuing to put out the absolute best episodes that we can. In this episode, as we continue our around the world tour of ghost tours, we head west, over the Rockies, to Victoria, British Columbia, to speak with our good friends from Ghostly Walks. Before we get to that, it's hard to believe we are now in August, the last month of the summer, and the weather recently has really been spectacular. Guests have been sending us photos of some incredible sunsets from our haunted locations. I was out myself this weekend at the Mackenzie King Estate, and the summer is such a nice time to get out, walk around, get some of that evening air, and of course, hear some of the best ghost stories from Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario. We hope if you haven't had a chance yet this summer, or you're still making your plans, you'll consider spending a little time with us, whether you are a local or a visitor. Information about all our tours can be found at hauntedwalk.com. We'd also love to connect with you on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all at Haunted Walk.
In 1999, I started my own company. It's called Discover the Past. We do specialize in history tours, but we also have ghost tours. And in fact, our mantra is history tours by day, ghostly walks by night. And although we enjoy the history tours a lot, the ghost tours outdraw the history tours 10 to 1. People love ghost stories, and we really enjoy telling the ghost stories. And along the way, I've become converted. I'm no longer telling people I don't believe in ghosts. I definitely do. So it's a labor of love. I've now retired from my job in museums and historic sites, and I'm a full-time guide. My name is John Adams, and I started my working career in museums and historic sites as a guide at a historic site, Fort Rodhill National Historic Site in Victoria. And that's where I learned how to be a guide, but from a historical point of view, and never really thought I would have a career doing that, but I did work in museums and historic sites, and was always called upon to do a history tour now and then for the local historical societies and groups of that sort. But my job wasn't primarily as a guide. But I liked it. People seemed to enjoy my tours. And many years ago, 1987, I'm a member of the Old Cemeteries Society here in Victoria. We began doing history tours on Sunday afternoons to encourage people to go to the cemetery and to be aware of the heritage importance of the place. And we shied away from ghost stories. We just wanted to be focusing on history and things that we thought would be non-controversial. But people wanted ghost stories, at Halloween especially. It's nice enough in Victoria. We can do the tours every week, all year. And at Halloween, people said, tell us a ghost story. I didn't really know any. In fact, to be honest, I'm not even sure I believed in ghosts. But nonetheless, we found a man who had written a book. His name is Robert Bellick. He lives near Vancouver, and he had written a wonderful book, Ghost Stories of British Columbia. And we asked him if he would come and be our guest tour leader around Halloween on an afternoon. We don't do the tours in the evening. And it was the best tour ever. More people came, and I realized then and there that people are interested in this topic. Anyway, he wasn't available in subsequent years because he doesn't live here, so he said, well, tell the stories yourself. We did, and more people began to come. And we realized that there is something here. We love doing history tours, but it seems there's much more demand for ghost tours.
John, I'm wondering what makes Ghostly Walks from Discover the Past maybe a little bit different or unique compared to other ghost tours that our listeners may have been on.
Well, of course, there are ghost tour companies all over the place. Every city has ghost tours, it seems, whether they're seasonal around Halloween or all year as we do. And each company does seem to have a different spin. First of all, we're storytellers. We don't use any special effects, except once in a while we do get asked to do a special tour, and we call that Ghostly Walks Extreme. But most of our tours are just a guide. We don't even wear period costume. We do wear black, and it's storytelling, good storytelling. And most of our stories are based on what actually happened, some history, and then the actual event, the haunting, whatever it might be. We don't jump out. We don't do any cheesy things of that sort, although some guides can be rather dramatic.
What makes Victoria a great haunted city?
Well, of course, if you, as you know, if you go to ghost tours, inevitably there will be a couple of superlatives that the city that you're in is the most haunted in wherever, whether it's in Canada, in the United States, in North America, or whatever. We often get asked, are you the most haunted city in Canada? Well, as you know, there are lots of other cities that might vie for that claim. But we can truly say that we are the most haunted city in the Pacific Northwest. And the Pacific Northwest is a kind of a generic term for the area around southwestern British Columbia, Vancouver Island, and parts of the United States, Washington State, and Oregon in particular. So that's our claim. And Victoria is a city that has a lot of history. First of all, there are First Nations thousands and thousands of years ago through most of this region. That's not unique to Victoria. But the climate really does encourage a lot of people to stay here. And so the First Nations population was very, very large. But Victoria is also the oldest city of any size in British Columbia. In fact, one of the oldest cities in the Pacific Northwest. So Europeans began arriving here early on, and it's far older than Vancouver, and at one time was the biggest city in British Columbia as well. So we have a lot of layers of history, and we do start with First Nations because their energy is here. We believe that ghosts are energy, human energy left after people die. And that's the most basic definition that we often use. So the First Nations were here for thousands of years. They died, and their energy was laid down upon this place, layer upon layer. So there's that, and then the fact that Europeans began to arrive, and in many cases did not pay any attention to the sites where the native people had been buried, and the belief was very strong that the dead are not to be disturbed. And so as the communities began to arise, whether it was a Hudson's Bay Company fur trading post or something else, a gold rush city, the graves of the First Nations were inevitably disturbed. So lots of things took place after that. There were the violent events that you would find with the gold rush or other activities. There were murders, there were slayings, there were beheadings, there were even Jack the Ripper-style murders in the early days here. And, of course, these sorts of things are going to build up energy as well. But in many cases, while we focus on some of those stories, there was energy on that spot, quite likely long before. So we like to say that the energy has been here building up over thousands of years, and everybody who lives is going to die, and they will become a ghost eventually, and every place is going to be haunted to some extent. But there are certain attributes here that maybe other places have in common. Salt water. Salt water is going to hold energy in a very special way. We're on an island. We're surrounded by this stuff. We have a very dense bedrock, and it's often said if you go to places like England with lots of haunted castles, it's the thick stone walls that hold the energy. Well, the bedrock here does the same thing. Many of those places were known as sacred sites to the native people, and were surrounded by hills and mountains on every side. So a number of these things hold the energy in a very special way. So we have the history over a long period of time, and we have the reasons, the physical reasons for holding that energy here. And I think maybe because of all of this, in this part of the world, on the West Coast, people are more in tune with this sort of thing. So you don't have to go very far here in Victoria for people to start talking about ghosts. If I meet somebody and they say, "Oh, you're the guy that does the ghost tours. You're the Ghostly Walks guy." Yeah, and they don't make fun of it. They start telling me their stories. It's commonplace here. People are very open about the fact that ghosts can exist and do exist, and want to tell us and share with us their stories. So I know that's different from some other places where people don't like to talk about this sort of stuff. But out here, I think perhaps because there is just so much of it, people are very open. So I think that makes us a little different than some other places.
John, could you share with us one of your favorite stories to tell on tour?
We started doing the tours in 1999. And the following year, I was developing a new route and just happened to be in one place. And I just wanted to let the people know along the way that they might see a group out in front and that they shouldn't be alarmed, and just to let them know what we were doing. Well, I was standing in front of one small restaurant. Johnson Street was the old red light district in Victoria, and there's a beautiful place called Market Square that is on Johnson Street. And there's a good spot for stopping, and I had a story nearby. And as I stood there, and the owner of the restaurant came out and he said, "Hi, I've got a story for you." It's not unusual. We often get that sort of thing. And so he told me the story. And it's a very small restaurant. The kitchen it's actually in a basement area. And the kitchen is more or less under the sidewalk. A rather cramped kitchen. And late at night, when the staff were cleaning up and preparing for the next day, they often would discover an old man standing there. At first, they were quite alarmed. They thought that somebody had strayed in from the street, but it was quite clear that this was not a living being. This was a ghost. And he stood there. He was quite clearly looking at them. They felt uneasy, as you might imagine. And I said to the owner, could he get a little bit more detail? He did not have the experience himself, so he went in and he talked to his kitchen staff, and he came back out and said, well, here's what they're telling me. It's a very old man. He appears to be Chinese, and there's something wrong with his back. He used the term hunchback to describe it, a very old man with a stooped back. And he said, there's something else they're telling me. When they see him, he's floating above the floor, about 2 or maybe 3 feet. And that's one of the reasons they know he's not real. He's floating above the floor, and then after a while he just seems to vanish. So uneasy, yes, but they know it's going to go away. Nobody seemed to know who it was. Well, immediately I thought that it might be related to another story that I had. There was a murder, a horrible slaying, where a young woman slashed her boyfriend's throat with his own straight razor. And the ghosts have certainly resulted from that. But that turned out to be in the building next door to where the restaurant is. And the young man whose throat was slit was very young. So this was not, obviously, the same event. Anyway, I tucked the story away. I told the story a few times, but still had no idea who it was. And a neighbor of mine, an older fellow who was an architect, was stopping to chat one day just at the gate. And he'd heard I was doing the tours, and he seemed interested, although he started off right away by saying he didn't believe in ghosts. Fair enough. So he said, well, tell me a story. And so I happened to mention this story. It turns out that he had worked as an architect on developing that area. Very, very run-down old buildings. And in the 1970s, he and his brother, who was a developer, had bought the buildings and had started to restore them. And when I told him the story, I could see that he was interested, and he said, tell me more specifically where this is taking place. And I told him, and he said, and it's an old Chinese man stooped over, and he's floating above the floor. He then told me his version of the story from when the building was redeveloped back in 1975. It seems that the building had been an old hotel, the Strand Hotel. We had known that, and well, it wasn't a very salubrious place. It was a very run-down, very, very rough hotel, and it was probably on the verge of being torn down when the developers bought it. Anyway, my friend said that one day they had to go and tell all the tenants, there weren't many of them left, that it was time to move on. They were going to start the development. And there was only one fellow left in the old Strand Hotel. It was the caretaker, and he'd been around longer than anyone could remember. And they were not relishing the idea that they had to go and tell him to move out. He had a room upstairs, but he was getting old, and so he had created for himself a small bedroom down in the cellar. where the furnace was, the wood box was there, the coal bin, and his tool bench, and so on. And he'd created a small cubicle off to one side near the furnace. And they saw him go in there, so they followed him in. And they waited a moment, and they knocked on the door, and there was no response. And they looked in, and the old fellow had gone to his bed, lay down, and had died. And he said he can still vision this. It was a very frightening experience. And I said, well, what did he look like? He was an old man, Chinese, bent over. And I said, oh, that's exactly where the kitchen of that restaurant is now. And he said, there's more. You see, the basement areas there were just dirt floors. They were never really intended for any sort of public or retail use at all. And it turns out that there was a huge ledge of rock running under the building. This is not unusual. The bedrock underlies all of Victoria. And so they had brought in jackhammers, and they had carefully jackhammered out that ledge of rock. And once the floor was level, they poured a whole new floor, the floor that's there now. Of course, the old caretaker had come back as a ghost, and he was floating above the current floor. He was standing at the level of the floor where it had been when he lived there and when he died in that space. So I could see the hair rising on my friend's arms as he was telling me the story, even though he claimed he didn't believe in ghosts. But that's a story that we still tell. And the little restaurant is a favorite spot for many, many people. But that's just one of many ghosts in that part of town. And a couple of unrelated events. People just telling me stories linking together to a fairly major sighting and a fairly major ghost story.
If our listeners are interested in learning more about Discover the Past and Ghostly Walks, where is the best place for them to go to get some information?
The best way to find out about our tours is our website, www.ghoslywalks.com. And ghostly is Ghostly, ghoslywalks.com. And all the information is there. And if they wish, they can also give us a phone call. Some people find it more difficult to use the internet sometimes, but most people also have a phone. So our phone number is area code 250-384-6698.
A big thank you to John Adams from Ghostly Walks for speaking with us today, and I'd highly encourage you to check out their tours if you find yourself in Victoria, British Columbia. If you've been on one of John's Ghostly Walks, we'd love to hear about it. Be sure to connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all at Haunted Walk. Information about our tours can be found on our website, which is hauntedwalk.com. If you're enjoying the episodes, please leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to us. As always, a big thank you to Michelle Dennis, our audio editor, and to Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com for the additional music. Until we meet again next week, sweet dreams.